Our topic is the national security choices of the Bush administration. Our speaker is Michael E. O'Hanlon, whose forthcoming book is almost that title. Dr. O'Hanlon received his higher education at Princeton, his Bachelor of Science degree, his Master of Science degree, and his PhD in Public Policy and International Affairs. He's been a member of the Peace Corps, as a volunteer. He worked for the Institute of Defense Analyses. He was with the Bureau of the Budget, and now, of course, is with the Brookings Institution. His primary, Mr. O'Hanlon was amused because there was a comment in the audience, he's young. And of course, for all of us, if you're in your 40s, you're young, very young. Okay. If you're in your 60s, you're pretty young. Well, that's middle age. It's no longer young. But in all of these positions, he's gained a wide expertise in defense and security matters. He's covered an awful lot of topics. He's dealt with planning and technology within the security area. He's done regional studies, security in the Middle East, security in the Balkans. He's studied the militaries of significant powers of China, North Korea, American troops or forces in Japan, modifications of NATO. And he's also studied a lot of particular interesting questions like humanitarian intervention. His work has been published in all of the major journals, I think, in the United States. They're just wonderful journals. All the impressive ones are among those in which his numerous works have appeared. He's written 7 books since 1995 on these defense matters. And Mr. O'Hanlon says some aren't real big. And they have very large print also. He also, of course, has appeared on all of the electronic media major outlets and has written op-ed pieces for the elite media of the country. So it's a wonderful, broad background and underpinning that he's established in the area of defense studies. Hardly an area hasn't been covered. It's my great pleasure to present to you Mr. Michael E. O'Hanlon.
Thank you very much, President Byrd, for the nice introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is U.S. defense planning and where we stand in broader matters of U.S. defense policy right now. And I think some choices the Bush administration is facing and going to have to face as Secretary Rumsfeld and others come to their decisions about defense priorities in the next few months. So there are obviously a host of things we could discuss. And I'm not going to touch on each and every one in my introductory remarks because I'm sure you'll steer me in interesting directions in the discussion, and I'd like to make sure we have plenty of time for that. So some of the things I won't discuss, for example, are the whole set of issues called sometimes homeland defense, dealing with terrorism and other such matters on our own territory. I'm also not going to speak a lot about this debate about a revolution in military affairs and where we stand in technology and just how much we're at the forefront of fundamental new capabilities in defense that may make this period comparable to the 1930s and 40s when blitzkrieg was invented, aircraft carriers, amphibious warfare, as we now know it, nuclear weapons. We can talk about all of that later, but what I want to talk about to start are really just 4 topics. First, I want to go over a broad introduction to where we stand today in U.S. defense planning and in the defense drawdown after the Cold War. I don't want to bore you with a whole lot of facts and figures, and I realize most people in this sort of an audience are fairly familiar with the basics, but I just want to get a few pieces of information on the table to just give us an orientation and a bottom line from which to work. And then I want to focus on 3 big policy issues. One is this hot button issue of military readiness. Are today's U.S. men and women of the armed forces ready for combat? The issue that was prominent last year in the presidential race. And I want to talk about that. And to my mind, the short answer, just to preview where I'm going, is that Gore was basically right about the quality of the force, but Bush was basically right about the need to still make some improvements. In other words, the sky was not falling, but there were enough strains and cracks that it was better to be a little hypervigilant than to ignore the problem. And then I want to talk a bit about, and I want to propose some solutions, some ways in which we could address some of these strains and cracks in the armed forces today, partly by focusing on overseas military commitments and where we might be able to streamline a little bit. Secondly, I want to talk about the basic way we organize U.S. defense forces today, the so-called two-war framework, the idea that we should have the capability to fight essentially two simultaneous desert storms. The Pentagon doesn't call them simultaneous, it calls them nearly simultaneous because they don't want to buy enough airplanes and ships to move all the equipment to two different places at the same time. They do want to have enough combat capability to fight two wars that are almost simultaneous and begin by maybe a 1 to 3 month stagger and then continue onward in an overlapping fashion. What sort of strategy should we have? Is that the right one? Is that the one that we, even if there's a certain logic to the prudence of this two desert storm construct, is it really realistic? Are we over-insuring against the Iraqs and North Koreas of the world with this framework and under-investing in certain other capabilities? And as you maybe have already guessed from the way I couched the question, I would agree with most defense critics who say we have been a little too focused on the two desert storm scenario, probably not focused enough on other things, and we should at least make a gentle shift away from the current strategy, in my judgment. And I'll say more about that in a minute. And then finally, maybe the hottest button issue of all for many people in this room, I'm sure, and for certainly many folks around the country, the question of national missile defense. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Even the NMD slogan, National Missile Defense, has already been modified a little bit by the Bush team in what I think is a very useful way to talk about allied missile defense on the grounds that if we're defended, but the allies are not, it's questionable how much good it does us to be able to protect ourselves when Saddam can simply threaten France or Japan or whoever instead of us, and how much strategic benefit do we get from that situation. So I'd like to get into that question as well. I do support a limited missile defense for the United States and its allies, but I don't think we can afford to do this abruptly with the wrong technology or with too much money. I don't think we need to spend, and I don't think we should spend too much. And I think it's very important to think about which countries we're going to focus the capability on. If we try to defend against a Russian or even a Chinese capability, I think we may bite off more problems for ourselves than we solve. So those are the things I want to talk about. And let me just spend about 5 minutes on each one, and then we can go from there. And I'll take my watch off and try to track my remarks because these topics are so big that obviously I'm going to have to try to be disciplined to stay to a half-hour introductory set of comments. First of all, where do we stand in the U.S. defense drawdown today? Well, sort of an amusing way to look at this question is to just pretend on the one hand that I'm an extreme hawk and then that I'm an extreme dove and throw out a few figures at you that each side might use. And these are the ones that we all tend to see in the newspaper, so they'll come as no great surprise to you. But a hawk would say, today we're spending only 3% of our gross domestic product on defense. Coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, the last time we spent such a small percentage of our national economic output on the military was just before Pearl Harbor. And therefore, one conjures up the image of a nation that has brought down its defenses precipitously and that has left itself vulnerable the way we were in 1939, 1940, in the years preceding the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And that's sort of the classic line you get from hawks. We've cut already by a lot. The military is 1/3 smaller than it was in the Cold War under Ronald Reagan and previous Cold War presidents. We've gone through this abrupt reduction in the budget. We used to spend essentially $100 billion a year more on the military when you adjust for inflation. We used to spend around $400 billion a year in the 1980s. Now we spend around $300 billion. That's quite a sharp cut, and it's gone along with a 1/3 reduction in the military, and isn't that already enough? And look at all the problems we've caused for ourselves in terms of people working too hard as a result of having cut. That's the classic argument by the hawks. And all the facts and figures they cite are basically correct. Then there's the set of arguments that the Doves will make. Even though we have cut, we still spend about 90% of the average U.S. defense spending level of the entire Cold War period. So if you look at 1980, 1985, 1990, in those latter couple of years, under the Ronald Reagan buildup, we were at an unusually high point in our Cold War defense spending, rivaled really only by the Vietnam era. And it's not appropriate to compare to that top peak. If you compare to the average from 1950 through 1990, that average was actually about $335 billion when you express it in today's dollar terms. And now we're spending about $295 with no Soviet Union to worry about. So doesn't this suggest that we're still spending a pretty robust amount of money if it's still almost 90% of the Cold War total? That's one argument Doves make. Second argument, of course, is that we spend far more than anybody else, which is true. We spend 7 times as much as anybody else, although it's very hard to measure Russia and Russia's and China's defense budgets, and we can talk about that later if you'd like. There's probably a factor of 2 uncertainty, factor of roughly 50 to 100% uncertainty in our estimates of how much China and Russia actually spend on their militaries. But the bottom line is that it's not anything close to what we spend. It's somewhere in the vicinity of 40 billion to 60 billion each in American dollars, and we spend 295. Not only that, not only do we spend 7 times as much as anybody else, and as much as the next 8 countries combined on that global defense spending list, but 6 of those countries are U.S. allies, and which is sort of reassuring. And it's the four biggies of Britain, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and then we have countries like Italy that are in sort of the $22 billion range. And so the United States is in a very commanding position. Never before in the history of the world, really, I don't think, has this situation been so striking, where one country and its allies dominate somewhere around 70-75% of all global defense spending. So it's an extraordinarily reassuring position to be in, and the Doves are right to quote those statistics. But how can all these statistics all be true at the same time? Well, maybe what it says is he shouldn't try to base defense policy on a couple of statistics and a couple of anecdotes. So I'm just using these to sort of make fun of the defense policy debate as it's sometimes soundbited in newspapers or on TV or on the campaign trails. But the bottom line is, depending on how you look at it, you can make an argument we spend quite a bit or not that much. And the bottom line is you have to look deeper, to my mind. You have to sort of throw away that level of analysis and say it doesn't really resolve anything. So yeah, we spend 88% of the Cold War average. Okay, that sounds like a lot. I'm not sure if it's too much or too little. Let me go on to a more serious and more detailed form of analytical approach. But that is where we stand. Today's military is about 2/3 the size of where it was at the 1990 end of the Cold War period. The defense drawdown is essentially done. We're still reducing the size of the military by a few tens of thousands of people, but active duty forces have come down by 700,000 already since the end of the Cold War. Civilian workforce has come down by almost 500,000, and the remaining cutbacks that are programmed would total only something like 50 to 75,000 between the two of those categories combined. So we're more than 90% of the way through the defense drawdown, and whether you agree with Al Gore or George Bush, it was unquestionably, to my mind, the most successful defense drawdown period in the nation's history. I know of no other period. Perhaps some historians in the room can tell me something about what we did after the War of 1812 or something like that. But in the 20th century, this was easily the most successful drawdown. If you measure the quality of our military at any point in the 1990s against where it had been in the 1980s, it was remarkably good. And I'm not trying to sound partisan and give Bill Clinton credit or Newt Gingrich credit. I would like to give the men and women of the armed forces credit. They did a remarkably good job, and under some pretty demanding circumstances. A lot of work was assigned to them. A lot of different kinds of missions were expected of them. And despite all of these challenges, they performed extraordinarily well. So unquestionably, the best drawdown in the nation's history. We still have an excellent military today. That's basically where we stand in terms of broad numbers. Let me just give you maybe 1 or 2 more. In the Cold War, we tended to have about 500,000 people abroad out of the active duty military. So close to 25%. The vast majority were, well, I shouldn't say the vast majority, but the majority were in Germany. And then we had other important European presences in Britain, Italy, and elsewhere. And then, of course, our East Asia presence, Japan, Korea, and at that time, the Philippines. And, of course, the Navy's presence throughout the world, Navy Marine presence at sea. That was essentially the Cold War overseas presence. Since the Cold War ended, we have cut that 500,000 number in half. We now have about 250,000 people abroad at any one time. And the distribution of forces, again, as many of you know, we basically have 100,000 in Europe, 100,000 in East Asia, and about now 30,000 in the Persian Gulf vicinity. So the Persian Gulf vicinity, that's the new deployment. That's the new big strategic deployment we did not have during most of the Cold War. But of course, in the aftermath of Desert Storm, it's become part of the landscape. The European deployments tend to exceed 100,000 by a little bit. The ones in East Asia tend to add up to roughly just about 100,000. And that's basically how things work today. One question that raises is, why is this such a problem, therefore, to maintain this set of deployments? We've cut the force by a third. We've cut overseas presence by fully half. That makes it sound like it shouldn't be such a burden to maintain the commitments we have today. The reason why it is a burden is because the places that we've cut our forces were the places where it was nice to be based. We've cut a lot of the forces in Germany. We've cut a lot of the forces in places where you could go and bring your family and have a nice lifestyle, where the U.S. military had a more or less permanent presence, set up its own communities, also in countries that many Americans enjoy living in, enjoy visiting. I wouldn't have minded probably in the Cold War having been based in Germany for a while. Once you kind of get used to the risk of war and being a few hundred or tens of miles away from a lot of Soviet tanks, it's probably not a bad place to live. Whereas today, of course, we still have some of those forces in Germany, about 70,000. We still have 10,000 people in Britain, 10,000 in Italy. We still have 40,000 in Japan, and still have 37,000 in Korea. But we also have a lot of people in the Persian Gulf. Those people are not generally based in nice, comfortable surroundings, generally not with their families. The Navy and the Marine Corps have not reduced their overseas deployments in a way that's proportionate to the size of the force structure. And therefore, overall, today's presence abroad is more difficult per person. So even though the size, the total number of people abroad are fewer, the actual difficulty of maintaining those deployments is greater, because they really are deployments today as opposed to basing abroad for the most part, or at least to a greater extent than before. A couple more facts and figures, and then I promise to move on into policy debates. In the 1990s, one thing we did during our defense cuts was to really cut out a lot of spending on weaponry. And I'm not saying this just because Northrop Grumman hosted the happy hour, and we all know about the experience of the B-2 bomber production line, which was certainly one of the casualties of the end of the Cold War, if you want to put it that way. But it is true across the defense industrial base in general, that we used to spend about a quarter out of every defense dollar buying weapons and hardware. And in the 1990s, we spent about 15 cents. So in other words, the cut was much more than proportionate. The cut in spending on weaponry was above and beyond what one would have expected based on a one-third reduction in the size of the force. The basic reason was we had bought a lot of stuff under Ronald Reagan, and we had a lot of new equipment. And what was not new, we could make the first to go as we reduced the size of the force. So to the extent you had certain equipment that was no longer required because your force was being cut by a third, you get rid of the old stuff first. That buys you even more time before you have to replace your equipment stock. But of course, the bad news is you can't have a procurement holiday forever, and it's about time to end it, because now we're getting to the point where our typical fighter jets, our typical Army transport helicopters, and many other things are becoming less reliable and will soon become less safe. And I think at that point, you really have to be attentive. You cannot ask the men and women of the armed forces to operate equipment that's not fundamentally reliable and safe. We can debate whether we buy F-22 fighters or simpler fighters. We can debate whether we buy more B-2 bombers or not. But we cannot ask the men and women of the armed forces to operate unsafe and undependable equipment. So we're going to have to get that procurement budget back up closer to, say, the 25% level of overall defense spending that it used to be. And that's a big challenge for the Bush administration. They're going to have to find a way to do that. The Clinton administration always wanted to, and what they found was they kept putting it off, the reason being it kept costing more money to operate the force each and every year. The operations and maintenance accounts that fund everything from closing bases to training to repairing equipment, these costs kept going up more than anybody expected. And I was certainly wrong in my best guesstimates of how many dollars would be required to maintain a certain level of readiness. The Pentagon was wrong. Basically, everybody got this one wrong. We were all surprised at how much money kept having to be migrated from our plans to increase procurement spending into those more more mundane accounts in the operations and maintenance budget. So we put it off, partly because we could afford to, in the sense that we still had enough equipment that was serviceable. We didn't have to be in a rush to replace aging systems, but it's about time to end that. Okay, those are a few facts and figures. Now let me move on to these three big policy debates, starting with military readiness. And again, it's not that long since the presidential campaign, so I probably don't have to remind too many of you just what was said during the campaign about readiness. And to someone who was trying to follow the facts and figures, I have to say it was a little bit regrettable. You don't expect to have the most nuanced discussions in a presidential debate, but nonetheless, you had Mr. Bush saying the sky was falling. You had Mr. Gore saying we're basically in nirvana, and I would have preferred a much more nuanced discussion, because the facts of the matter are that we still have a military that's in a good, solid A-B+ condition. However, the trend lines are in the wrong direction. So it's an outstanding military, but it has some real problems. Some of them have been fixed in the last couple of years. Some of them have not yet been fixed. And therefore, that's why I say Gore was closer to being right when he said the military was excellent. But Bush was closer to being right, in my judgment, when he said there are problems out there we got to fix. And let's not be complacent about an A-B+ grade. Let's make sure the trend lines no longer keep going downward, but start plateauing and maybe going upward. But the bottom line is, if you look, and I'll explain how I arrive at this conclusion in a few minutes, and some of you may challenge me on the way I go about it in the Q&A. But the basic way I look at this is, if you look at quantitative metrics, and I'm not trying to sound like some, a green eye shades guy who thinks you can measure each and everything with just the perfect data point. But even if you include metrics concerning morale, concerning people's interest in making the military a career, and try to get at some of the human angles and human dimensions of the military. If you look across a whole slew of statistics, today's military and last year's military is roughly comparable to the condition of Ronald Reagan's military. Not quite as good as George Bush's military, George Bush the first. That was the peak. That was the best time. Desert Storm and the immediate aftermath of Desert Storm, that was, by most of these metrics, the time when our military was at its best in modern American history. However, today's levels are still comparable to, say, 1985, 86, 87 Reagan levels. The kinds of statistics that I use to try to measure this, and that the military services use themselves, relate to, on the one hand, equipment, and on the other hand, people. The two basic ingredients of readiness. You've got to have the right kinds of people and enough of them, and they've got to be properly trained. And you've got to have equipment that is adequate in number and serviceable. Those are your two major categories of requirement. By the way, I'm using readiness here in a pretty limited, narrow way. I'm not talking about broader questions of strategic preparedness. Are we preparing for the right threats? We can talk about that in the Q&A, and I'll talk a little bit about it in just a minute when I talk about revising the two-war framework that we now have today. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the narrow question of, given the demands we place on the 1st Armored Division, can it do its job as defined by current Pentagon plans? Leaving aside the debate about whether those requirements and those plans are the correct ones, given those requirements, can we satisfy those demands today? In other words, are the military units in today's force, is there an internal self-consistency to their preparedness? Are they ready for what they're supposed to be ready for? The bottom line answer is pretty much yes. If you look, for example, at the number of airplanes that are ready to fly at a given minute, out of the total percentage we have in the force, the Air Force numbers have come down somewhat. In the early 1990s, the Air Force tended to have 83-84% of its airplanes ready to fly, mission capable at a given moment. And today the number is down to 73-74%. That's the bad news. The good news is, with the Marine Corps and the Navy, you have not seen that sort of deterioration in the readiness of airplanes. With the Army, overall readiness has actually gone up a little bit in the 1990s. And training levels remain roughly as rigorous as they were in the 1980s and early 90s. And to the extent there have been any reductions at all in training, to some extent, improved simulators have compensated. Now, there have been a couple of cuts in training that would not have been ideal or preferable. There has been a little bit of a nicking away at the preparation of certain units. But across the force, whether you look at flying hours per unit, miles driven per tank, steaming days per quarter of the Navy, the military is still extraordinarily ready. In terms of people, today's military personnel still are quite capable, not just as evidenced by their performance in places like Kosovo, but also based on their aptitude levels, on their experience levels within the military, how they compare to sort of their cohorts in their same demographic groups in the civilian population. If you look at these people, they are still an extraordinary bunch. But where's the problem? Well, there are two problems. There are two looming problems. One of them is the equipment that we have today is wearing out. And we've got to replace that. Even if today's equipment is in okay shape, again, the trend lines have been in the wrong direction. And as equipment continues to get older, the trend lines are going to keep going in the wrong direction. And we got to stop that. The second problem is, even though I've told you that people in today's military are extraordinarily capable, and I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that and probably wouldn't contest that, I'm sure many of you are wanting to already get up out of your seat and say, yeah, but they're working too hard, and a lot of them are leaving. A lot of the good people are leaving, and that's also true. So we need to find a way to relieve the burden to some extent on some of these people. Now, military service has always been hard. It's always going to be hard. It's not going to be the sort of thing you go into for a vacation, so we shouldn't necessarily aspire to make it easy. But we have to avoid a situation where people are spending 3, 4, 5, 6 months of the year away from their families, for example. I think a pretty rock-solid requirement for decent military life is that you can be near your family most of the time, at least in peacetime. And that's just one example. Also, even if no one goes into the military to get rich, people should be paid at a level that's roughly commensurate with what they could make in the private sector. The good news is that latter problem has largely been solved. And a lot of what you heard, or may have heard in the last few years about a military-civilian pay gap is basically wrong. Basically, if you look at the detailed analyses of a person with a given set of technical skills and a given experience level, and you compare what that person makes in today's military to what that person would be expected to make typically in the private sector, military people are actually paid reasonably well, with a couple of exceptions. Higher-level officers are not paid well. Pilots are not paid well in the military. Electronics technicians are not paid well. Areas in which the civilian economy rewards certain skill sets, those people could make a lot more in the military if they left and went to the private sector. But most people in the military today are making a pretty decent wage, given their age, given their experience, given their educational background. I'm not saying that's necessarily adequate, because in many cases they're working a little bit harder than their civilian counterparts. Not that civilians have an easy life either, but sometimes military folks are working a little bit harder, and obviously there's a certain trust that the nation is asking of them for them to be willing to put their lives on the line, if necessary, in the defense of the national interest. So I'm not trying to say that we should end the debate about proper military compensation, but I think basically it's not too bad. But I'm worried about people working too hard and being away from home too much. I think those are the big questions. So for me, to solve that question, or solve that problem, I think we have to look at where we're deploying forces abroad today. Governor Bush last year, when he was still governor of Texas, he said, peacekeeping is the problem, and the Balkans are the problem. Well, you know, the Balkans have been the new demand on the Army. It is true that if you look at the 4 military services, the Balkans have been the latest demand on the Army. But otherwise, I have to pick a little bit of a dispute with the President, because for the other services, the demands are elsewhere, and they have nothing to do with peacekeeping. For the Air Force, what's hard is maintaining the no-fly zone over Iraq. I don't call that peacekeeping. I call that keeping Saddam Hussein in a box in defense of our vital strategic national interests. We can debate whether the no-fly zone is the right way to do it, and I've tried to write in this book, which you're all, of course, more than invited to purchase from Brookings if you like. And I summarize this part of the argument in an article in Foreign Affairs too, so that's a cheaper way to get at it if you like. But the basic argument would be that the no-fly zone over Iraq may or may not be the ideal way to put pressure on Saddam and try to protect Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Iraq's own minority populations. But the basic idea of putting pressure on Saddam is not peacekeeping. It's not what we think about when we think about sort of military deployments to go and help starving people or help people who are in civil conflict with each other in places of the world of no great national importance to the United States. That is not the case with the no-fly zone. The Navy is working hard in the Western Pacific, near China, near Korea, in the Persian Gulf, near Iraq and Iran, and in the Mediterranean. Again, these are not peacekeeping missions. To some modest extent, The Navy has been focused on the Balkans too, but that has not been its major source of operational demand or deployment. The major sources have not had to do with the Balkans or peacekeeping. They've had to do with the Persian Gulf and the Western Pacific. And likewise for the Marines, if you look at overall Marine Corps deployments around the world today, where Marines are away from their families and away from home base and permanent station, these deployments are primarily in the Western Pacific and the Persian Gulf. And a big example would be the Marine Corps presence on Okinawa in Japan. Roughly 10,000 Marines there are away from home base and away from families. So what I would propose doing is thinking through these deployments, going through each one and looking at the details of how many people we really need to accomplish the mission. And it's not all going to be a debate about peacekeeping. I think we should keep all the forces in Korea. I think Korea is still unsettled enough that I don't want to think hard about the symbolic effect alone of pulling people out of Korea. I think would be counterproductive. So I don't really want to have a debate about U.S. forces in Korea. And the U.S. forces in Germany and Britain and Italy, I think, are a useful enough pillar to our NATO alliance and not particularly hard on the people who are manning those deployments. But again, I'm not too focused on those. What I would really propose we focus on are the Balkans, Mediterranean Sea, naval deployment, the no-fly zone over Iraq, and the Marine Corps deployment on Okinawa. And I'll save a detailed discussion for later, if you'd like, on where I would propose reducing. But I'll just quickly say that I think in the Balkans, we're doing the right thing already by continuing to reduce the number of people in Bosnia, which is relatively stable, while keeping our forces robust in Kosovo, which is not stable, and where the Serbs and the ethnic Albanians still have a fundamental dispute over who deserves to control that land, not to mention the problems in neighboring Macedonia. So the idea of the United States weakening its commitment to the NATO operation in Kosovo, I think would be a very bad idea. And by the way, we're only providing 20% of the total there. The Europeans are providing 80% in both Bosnia and Kosovo, so it's not as if there's some unfair burden sharing here. If we want to stay the leader of NATO, I think we have to stay strong in Kosovo at about today's force levels. But I think the administration is correct to be downsizing even more the presence in Bosnia. We went into Bosnia with 20,000 U.S. troops in 1995 as part of an overall NATO deployment of almost 60,000 troops. Today, we are already headed down to 3,500 Americans, which will already be a cut of about 50% from last year's time frame when Mr. Bush was debating this with Mr. Gore on the campaign trail. So the Bosnia cuts are underway, and I think they make sense. So that's a good set of decisions, and I think we should continue on that path. Keep maybe a brigade in Bosnia and the current force in Kosovo. With the no-fly zone mission over Iraq, I'll just quickly mention that I would propose changing the way we do that. Instead of trying to monitor the airspace of Iraq all the time, I think now it's possible to think about retaliating against any Iraqi large-scale flights that are used against its own population or against neighbors, and not worry quite as much about keeping Iraqi airplanes out of the sky each and every moment. If you do that, you can reduce this extreme burden on the Air Force. You still need a lot of American military power in place because you want to be able to respond quickly to any threat against Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, but I don't think you need to have the 260 airplanes that we have north and south of Iraq today. And finally, Okinawa, I think there are ways to maintain a strong presence in the Western Pacific without having all those people, all those Marines on Okinawa on a quasi-permanent basis. You can use Okinawa more as a staging area, use it as a place from which to sail smaller numbers of Marine forces and from which to launch a large armada if you ever need to for a major conflict. You don't need to have the Marines there day to day. It's not a very good place to train anyway, and it's not very good for the U.S.-Japan alliance because it's tough on Japan. Their politics are not handling this deployment very well. So these are some of the ideas I put forth for why I think we can cut back numbers in Bosnia, Iraq, Okinawa, and also, by the way, the Mediterranean, but I won't go into that now. So that's how I think you deal with readiness. You make life a little bit easier on people so they don't have to spend quite as much time away from their families, and that's the basic remaining problem. The pay problem is not severe. The quality of people we're getting is good. A lot of the problems with recruiting and retention that we had 2 and 3 years ago have apparently now been solved by the pay raise, restoration of better retirement benefits, better advertising campaigns by the military, and an effort to make some of these overseas deployments a little bit more feasible and a little bit more reasonable on people, which the services have already worked hard to get better at. So I think the remaining problem is to find ways to cut back on the numbers of people abroad, and I think there are very specific ways we can do that in a number of areas. Enough said on readiness, because I'm already coming up on a half hour, and I still have supposedly 2 topics to go. So I guess we can always leave one of them for discussion, but let me at least try to take a crack, if you don't mind. I think I'll take this off. Talking about all this stuff gets you worked up. I think I'll take a crack at the issue of the two-war framework. And as many of you know, the basic idea in today's military is we should have enough force to fight what are essentially 2 Desert Storm-like wars at the same time. Now, there's a lot of debate as to whether we could really do that, and as to whether these forces are really big enough to even entertain that as a viable, plausible option. But the basic concept here is, even if we don't have the ability to deploy quite as many divisions and wings and so forth as we did in 1990-91, we should have the ability to defeat soundly Iraq and or North Korea at the same time. The two-war framework in theory is about any generic enemy you want to imagine, but in practice it's really about Iraq and North Korea, because those have been the troubled spots in our last decade of force planning. And if you look at the first Bush administration, they focused on these 2 scenarios as their most demanding requirement for what they called the base force, which was their first post-Cold War force that Dick Cheney and Colin Powell devised. The Clinton administration came in under Les Aspin, and they said, you've got basically the right idea about scenarios, but we actually think that you can do it with slightly less force, so we're going to cut by an additional 10 to 15% the force structure, but keep basically the same strategic goal of having enough force to do large-scale counteroffensives against both Iraq and North Korea at the same time. That's the basic idea. More than 500,000 American troops in each place, deployed sequentially, not simultaneously. The assumption, again, is that you would start, maybe there would be a war that began in March in Korea, and then in the course of the next couple of months, Saddam would decide this was a good time to push, to see if he could challenge us and push his luck a little bit in the Persian Gulf. So you'd have another war potentially beginning 1 to 3 months later. That's the basic framework that we've had throughout the 1990s. Now, it seems reasonable enough, since both of these foes are pretty evident, pretty visible. And in fact, there was a review panel in '97 called the National Defense Panel that said maybe we don't need to have the capability for 2 of these wars at the same time. And they presented their findings to then Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, and Bill Cohen said, great, which bad guy do you want me to forget about? Saddam Hussein or Kim Jong-il? I thought it was a pretty powerful rebuttal by Cohen. And a lot of people, a lot of my friends on the dovish side of the defense debate, they'll say, hey, 1 war capability is enough. I used to think this myself for a short time, that a 1 war capability was sufficient, because, hey, all we ever fought during the Cold War was 1 war at a time. We either fought Korea or Vietnam or Desert Storm, and we had sort of 10-year separation periods between each conflict. And so what are the odds that we're going to have to fight 2 of these wars at the same time? Doesn't it seem a little bit unreasonable to raise the bar with the Cold War over? So there's a certain logic to saying you don't have to necessarily contemplate both of these conflicts being all out and simultaneous. However, the idea of saying that we're going to put all of our eggs in one basket and just have enough force to handle 1 war and leave ourselves vulnerable if and when we have to fight that war, and leave our deterrent weaker if and when we have to fight that war in all the rest of the world, I think is a bad idea. So I think you want to have a 2-theater capability, but there's a lot of room for debate about whether it has to be precisely what we have today. Again, today's, at least theoretical goal for the force is that we should have 500,000 to 600,000 Americans deployable in both the Persian Gulf and Korea at the same time. The main reason to have that many people, actually there are 2 reasons. One is in case our friends get overrun again before we get there in time, to be able to, of course, take back their territory and liberate their countries. The second reason, which is not commonly articulated as much in the public debate, is to overthrow the offending government, to overthrow Saddam or to overthrow Kim Jong-il and occupy their countries if we get into this kind of a war again. That's a perfectly reasonable goal to have, because I think, we're all still a little frustrated. We still have to live in a world with Saddam Hussein in charge of a country, and obviously Iraqis are even more frustrated by that fact than we are. And so if we do wind up in another war with Saddam, I think having an overthrow and occupy option makes a lot of sense. But when you put the thing in these terms, it makes you still start to say, you know, isn't this scenario even more pessimistic, even more worst case than I originally thought? You're telling me I need not just the capability for two major crises or conflicts, but the ability to overthrow two enemy governments and occupy two separate enemy territories at the same time. Isn't that a little bit too much of a demand on the military, especially because having such a worst-case framework for conventional warfighting leaves you insufficiently focused on China, insufficiently focused on national missile defense, on cruise missile defense, on technology development, and all the other things that may be more relevant to our future security than coping with the bad guys of yesterday, Saddam Hussein and Kim Jong-il. That's essentially the problem, that it's not so much that you wouldn't like to have this insurance policy against two simultaneous wars, but there's an opportunity cost associated with putting all of your eggs into those baskets and not having as much money to spend on other defense problems. Also, if you build your force structure in such a way that you can fight two of these wars at the same time, it gives you a very specific kind of force structure. And what it means is you may not have enough of the right kinds of units to sustain these long-standing deployments. You may be burning people out because you don't have enough crews to operate AWACS airplanes or EA-6B electronic jamming airplanes or some of the other specialized capabilities that you actually need to use quite a bit in peacetime. But because you're building a military that's big enough to fight two of these wars, you don't have any leftover money or people to have enough AWACS crews, electronic jamming aircraft, military police, and so on. So those parts of your military get overworked, overburdened, and essentially driven out of the force because people quit. So I think what we should consider instead is something I would call, and I'll wrap up with this because I have already gone long enough. We can save national missile defense for later. I would advocate something that I would still call a two-war capability. But I would get away from the image of conflict and combat that we've had in the 1990s. I don't think we have to be ready for two simultaneous, all-out, large-scale ground counteroffensives in two theaters at once, with the likely goal of overthrowing the enemy regime and occupying its territory. I think having the capability to do one of those all-out operations, together with a more limited combat operation elsewhere, is sufficient. And there are a number of reasons why I think that. I've already alluded to some of them. But also, if you look at the course of the 1990s, the Iraqi rearmament that we all feared in 1991 has not happened, because Saddam, of course, has put a greater premium on retaining his weapons of mass destruction than on getting sanctions lifted. If he had been a good boy in 92, 93, and let us inspect his weapons and his country and get the weapons out, he could have been back on the international arms market by now. And that's what people thought back in 91, 92, 93 when they devised this two-war framework, that Iraq would remilitarize perhaps to the level it had before Desert Storm. That's not turning out to be the case. North Korea has also declined. It's true in the last year North Korea has restored a little bit of its combat capability. But over the last 10 years, North Korea has definitely suffered, and its gross domestic product is now equivalent to the budget of the U.S. Marine Corps. It's now about $12 billion. It's been cut in half. It's lost all of its Soviet aid. Its economy is in a shambles. I'm not trying to say that that makes North Korea unthreatening. I'm not trying to go too far in the other direction. But I am trying to say its combat readiness is not what it used to be. And moreover, better yet, South Korea's combat readiness is better than it's ever been. And if you look at military data as to the capabilities of our major allies, I would put South Korea in the top 5. I think South Korea, first of all, in terms of where its country has come in the last half century, I think it may be, leaving aside the German and Japan experiences, I think South Korea may be the most fascinating and remarkable success story of a nation state in the second half of the 20th century. That's also been, and that's just a personal opinion, it has nothing to do with my area of expertise, but the nice thing is it's pretty documented that in the area of defense capability, South Korea has come remarkably far. Also, the defense capability that South Korea maintains below the DMZ with a little bit of American help, is actually the strongest in military history. It's a denser capability, a denser deployment than we even had in the intra-German area during the NATO-Warsaw Pact standoff of the Cold War. It's remarkably robust. And the idea that North Korea can penetrate those lines, I find increasingly far-fetched. So I think the main concern in Korea is still a serious concern. It's the concern that, of course, special forces and artillery that North Korea has in abundance could destroy Seoul. But I don't think that Seoul is at serious risk of being overrun. And I think when you factor that issue in to the decline in the North Korean capability, the decline in the Iraqi capability, you buy yourself a little more space to think about other problems. Of course, I'm not just trying to sound like a prophet of good news tonight, because we're all breathing a sigh of relief today that the standoff about the EP-3 on Hainan Island has been resolved. But we all, I think, are still worried. Whether you're an admirer of China or not, you're worried about the direction of U.S.-China relations and attentive to the tension between Taiwan and China. And I think we need to spend a little more time, intellectually at least, thinking about the possibility of war in the Taiwan Strait. In the 1990s, we did not spend a lot of time in the defense community thinking about that conflict. We tended to hope and assume that if we had a military big enough to deal with North Korea and Iraq and a Navy big enough to maintain global deployments, we could also handle the China-Taiwan problem. I actually think that's true, but it's almost accidental. And I spent 50 pages in this book that I just finished on the China-Taiwan problem because I plead guilty too. I had never spent enough time thinking about the China-Taiwan problem in military detail. And most other American defense planners have not as well. So if you look across our force structure, I think for the most part we're in pretty good shape being able to handle any situation in which Taiwan would need our military help. But we have to spend more time thinking about it. First of all, I could be wrong. My analysis could be incorrect. And there are people who know the specifics of this scenario and have access to classified information who know more about it than I do. Secondly, even if I'm right, there are obviously areas where China is improving its capabilities. And third, there are weaknesses that we continue to have that even today, if China was able to figure out what they were, Taiwan or the United States might be more vulnerable than we'd like to think. So I want to spend more time on that problem, a little bit less time over-insuring against the possibility of large-scale war in both Korea and Iraq at the same time. So again, to summarize, for this, I would wind up with a force structure that is still a two-war capability, but I would describe it differently. And I guess I don't quite have the best slogan. Maybe tonight somebody can come up with a slogan that would replace sort of the two Desert Storm or two major theater war construct. I don't really want to call it a 1.5 war capability because that sounds like less than two. And I think Mr. Rumsfeld is not going to want to come in as a Republican Secretary of Defense as part of an administration that just spent half the campaign beating up on Bill Clinton and Al Gore for their custodianship of the U.S. military and preside over a doctrine that admits to being less than what Bill Clinton gave you in the area of national security. Leaving aside the domestic politics of it, I don't think the Pentagon wants to signal to the world that we're becoming less engaged and less focused on deterrence. So you've got to find something. 1.5 is not a bad way to think about the force structure implications of some of what I'm saying. But for the international audience and for the Pentagon's official description of its new strategy and new capability, I think they want to emphasize this is still a multi-theater combat capability with the possibility of handling simultaneous wars in different parts of the world. But again, generalized to a broader set of scenarios. Think more about naval scenarios. Think more about terrorist scenarios. Think more about a whole range of options, some of which I'm sure we'll discuss in the Q&A that I promise now we'll get to. I think Mr. Rumsfeld really wants to broaden his view in this way. For one thing, it frees up some money because he can cut a little bit of force structure in the existing force. But secondly, it allows him to put some people into some of these units that are being over-deployed and overworked. And then third, it just opens up a lot of intellectual and defense planning room for these other scenarios that I think we have to get a little bit more serious about. So there's a lot more to discuss, but let me stop there and look forward very much to your reactions and questions.
Well, we thank you for that helpful overview and for whetting our appetites for the Q&A. The question is, would you comment on Mr. Putin's strategy for enhancing Russian influence in Europe, largely through NATO?
Well, it's a good question. I think Mr. Putin is trying, but I think he's also mostly failing. And one thing I would say, just to sort of begin the discussion about missile defense, this has been an area, I think his primary interest has really been in missile defense. He's realized that in the last few years, the United States has gotten more serious about wanting to have a missile defense that's not consistent with the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, banning all such defenses. And this was largely a Republican-driven idea going back to Ronald Reagan's day, of course, but the Clinton administration picked up on it, even though many of its top officials never really bought into it. Bill Clinton himself, for either political or sincere reasons, did. And therefore, Putin saw an opportunity to split the United States from its European allies, because most of our allies do not like the idea of national missile defense. They think it's an impediment to arms control, an impediment to better Western relations with Russia. And in the last year, Putin's been spending some time trying to devise clever little diplomatic strategies and clever little alternative missile defense capability proposals to try to divide Europe from the United States. And guess what? It hasn't worked. And by the way, even as a person who supported Gore, I will say that I prefer the way Bush has handled the initial diplomacy on missile defense, because what he said to Russia and the allies is, we are going to deploy one of these things. And we're going to make sure that we, so accept that. There's plenty of room for discussion as to when, what, how we're going to cover the allies, and how we will try to deal with Russia's security concerns as well. But we are going to do it. And I think everybody's figured that out. And I think the Russians have figured that out, and the Europeans. And the Europeans have now had to sit down and think hard and say, well, even if we don't like this idea that much, because they still don't much like it, can we really deny the American people the right to defend their own territory, even if they are, in our judgment, mistaken in their worry about the need to do so? And are we really going to let Russia play one part of the alliance off against the other? And I'm very encouraged to see, it's one more testament in my mind to the strength of NATO, that I think Putin's strategy has basically failed. So I think we're in pretty good shape.
Would you indeed answer the question as to what the North Koreans may be doing with respect to modernization and improving their army in particular?
North Korea is in such a bad position in terms of an armored assault south, I think, that one of the last military jobs I would want in the world would be to be in one of those tanks, whether it has a bigger gun or not. There has been no part of the world that's been more built up to deny that kind of tank capability than the DMZ and the area just below it by the Allies, by the United States and South Korea over the last half century. I think it's a killing zone for armor. If you look at the limited number of avenues of approach, if you look at all the dug-in emplacements that we have, and the ability of American air power to contribute quite a bit as well. Although North Korea, I'm sure, would be smart enough to attack on a cloudy day, and therefore our laser-guided bombs wouldn't work very well the first day. But if we fly below the clouds, or if we, by the second day, that's going to be one more reason why they're going to be in trouble. North Korea is not going to find a way to survive, to have its tanks survivable by putting bigger guns on. Because the bottom line is, the South Korean and American tanks are dug in and stationary, and they have laser rangefinders. The North Koreans may have a little bigger gun. They're still moving. They don't have stabilized turrets. They don't have laser rangefinders. They're vulnerable. They can't see us. We can see them. They're going to get their butts kicked if they try this. And the last thing, they have an outside chance of they will cause a lot of havoc, and it will be a much bloodier war for us, too, than Desert Storm. But that'll be because of the effects of their special forces and their artillery, which do not really give them the ability to see Seoul, but give them the ability to kill a lot of people. And I think they can do that. But I have no doubt, because of all the reasons I mentioned, about who would prevail in this conventional conflict.
You've been requested to comment on what could you use reduced military expenditures for in the United States, or how much better could you use it here, is really the question.
Well, of course, you're asking a very broad question about political priorities, and I'll just tell you what mine are and then, not bore you too much with any great detail. But one thing is, we've already decreased defense spending by a great deal. I mentioned it's now 3% of GDP. It was 6% under Reagan. It was 8, 9, and 10% in the Vietnam era, and also under Eisenhower. Today, defense is not the major. And back in the 80s, we used to have big debates about, as you know, about whether our high defense spending was causing us to fall behind Japan, fall behind Germany, and so forth. I think now we've put most of those fears to rest based on the strength of the American economy in the last decade, and also based on the fact that defense spending is a very modest percent of our GDP. Now, I would grant you that if we were spending too much, it would be nice to free up money, for more programs. I think most people, whether you're Republican or Democrat, would recognize and agree that it'd be nice if we could do something about the uninsured in health, for example. Regardless of whether you favor a market-oriented approach or a government approach, I think most people would agree that 45 million uninsured is too many and too bad. The question is, however, are we letting down our guard internationally in the meantime to the point where we're going to have to go back and build up to a higher level of defense and suffer casualties because we've allowed ourselves to essentially let down our guard to handle the problems you identify? My own view, where I come out, is I oppose the Bush tax cut proposal because I think we need to be able to do both. And I think that even though there may be, I just finished paying my marriage penalty the other day, and it didn't feel that good. But I could take a little solace knowing I was helping your program in Baltimore as a fellow Maryland taxpayer and a federal taxpayer. And that's just where my political priorities are. And I'm sure everybody else in this room could give a testament to what their priorities are, and they're all going to be different. But the bottom line is I don't think this is a choice of either or. We've already cut defense spending a great deal, and clearly the main trend in our economy is greater spending on entitlements and less spending on all discretionary programs combined, whether they're domestic or security related. And that's the trend that causes me concern, because there's no end in sight to that trend.
Would you give an argument in favor of a land-based missile defense system?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, some of the proposals for sea-based systems have been oversold. And the Heritage Foundation deserves a lot of credit for pointing out that there were options. But its math, the proposal that we could do this for $2 or $3 billion, I think was just simply wrong. Pentagon estimated that it would take $16 to $19 billion to do what Heritage said we could do from 2 to 4. Now, I'm not saying that there's a right answer or that the Pentagon got it all right and Heritage got it all wrong, but the 16 to 19 number is a lot more believable based on my reading of the respective studies. Having said that, and one more problem with the idea of using sea-based systems, for example, the missile tubes on the Aegis destroyers, they have the same vulnerability that the Clinton system does, because all of them have to operate outside the atmosphere at a point at which the enemy could deploy decoys that resemble warheads and are very hard to tell apart in the cold vacuum of outer space. So to me, it's not so much sea-based versus land-based. It's boost phase, shooting down the missile right after it's been launched versus trying to shoot it down later. And I favor the former. The other good thing about the former is boost phase defense, an ICBM burns for about 4 or 5 minutes after it's been launched. And during that time, it cannot yet send its warheads off because they have to be brought up to speed so they can go to the right place. So during that time, you got the whole system concentrated in one place. It's giving away its location because it's burning a lot of rocket fuel. And it's relatively vulnerable because if you go through that skin, it blows up. So that's the time you want to hit it. If you want to destroy it in the boost phase, you've got to have your defense system near the launch point, because you only have 4 or 5 minutes during which you've got to see the launch, react, get to wherever you have to be, and then hit the thing, either with an interceptor or a laser beam. Regardless, you've got to be close by. To my mind, that's a good thing, because it gives us a way to deploy missile defense without fundamentally antagonizing Russia or China, because a major continental power cannot be threatened by this sort of system, because it would have missile launch points too far into its interior to be able to be destroyed by a boost phase system. Now, I think China's a complicated case, and whether some people say China only has 20 ICBMs today, maybe we should try to defeat their missile force, especially because we have this Taiwan problem between us. I tend to think that China just has too many resources for us to realistically think we could defeat them with any national missile defense. So I wind up saying, let's build a defense to handle the Iraq, Iran, North Korea type capabilities if and when they develop. And let's find a way to do it that's both technologically promising and reassuring to the great powers who could otherwise react in ways that are going to degrade our security, because they will be paranoid, even if they don't have to worry. So I wind up favoring a limited national missile defense targeted on the so-called rogue states with boost phase technology. And that, to me, satisfies the greatest number of technological and strategic demands on any missile defense system.
We're going to have to yield to our time limitation, and simply thank you for sharing so much of your expertise with us. It's been a wonderful evening.